Imagine walking into your boss's office, right? Looking them dead in the eye and just telling them that their quarterly earnings presentation was the owl's bowels.
Yeah, that's a quick way to get fired today.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Security's probably escorting you out of the building immediately. But a century ago, you just gave them, like, the highest compliment possible.
Which is just so hard to wrap your head around, honestly.
It really is. And that is exactly the bizarre reality we are jumping into today. So, welcome to another deep dive. We have this really fascinating stack of sources exploring the hidden history of, well, the words you use every single day.
Right.
And we are going to completely shatter the illusion that your daily vocabulary belongs exclusively to, our modern world.
It really is a profound realization when you discover that the casual texts you send or like the phrases you just drop in work meetings are actually this unwitting inheritance.
Yeah, totally.
You think you're speaking the language of the 2020s, but you're often just channeling the 1920s.
Which is wild. We are talking about the era of flapper fashion, the jazz age, and the really chaotic, short-lived experiment of prohibition.
A very specific, very loud era.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to uncover how a very specific list of contemporary phrases managed to survive a century of human history, right? How they remain in your daily vocabulary, and more importantly, what those words reveal about the immense cultural whiplash of that specific era.
Because there really was this massive societal whiplash happening.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand where we are now, we have to look at the absolute absurdity of the slang people were actually using back then.
Yeah, the sources highlight a very specific, almost formulaic trend that it began simmering in the early 1900s, but it reached an absolute fever pitch by the 1920s.
Right.
If a young person in that era wanted to describe something as impressive or cutting edge or just generally excellent, they relied on this very rigid linguistic formula, which was, the something something.
And the formula almost always paired an animal with, like, a completely unrelated piece of anatomy or human clothing, which is just so weird.
Very weird.
The examples in the text are just wild. You have the clam's garters.
Right.
You have the worm's ribs.
Yeah.
The classic cat's pajamas. And then the truly unhinged ones, like our earlier example, the owl's bowels or the snake's hip.
Oh, the snake's hips, right. Yeah.
And finally, the one that you probably still use today, which is the bee's knees.
It really paints a highly surreal picture of how people were communicating.
It does. I mean, I am looking at this list, and I really have to challenge the underlying logic of this entire trend. Because you're painting a picture of a society embracing the future.
Right. Absolutely.
This is the 1920s. People are moving to massive cities. The skyline is just exploding with skyscrapers. Automobiles are taking over the street.
Right, modernization everywhere.
Yeah, so why is this cutting-edge modern generation so obsessed with barnyard animals and bugs? I mean, bees, cats, worms, clams. It sounds like an agrarian farming manual.
Yeah, it really does.
It doesn't sound like the slang of a rapidly industrializing society. Like, imagine trying to compliment a coworker's presentation today by calling it the owl's bowels. It just sounds absurd.
What's fascinating here is that the contradiction is actually the point.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Language acts as a massive generational filter, sure, but it also acts as a coping mechanism. The 1920s was a period of incredible, almost terrifying modernization.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, people were leaving the rural farms their families had worked for generations, and they're stepping into these loud, concrete metropolises. So, by mashing up rural imagery like worms and clams with modern urban concepts like girders and pajamas, they were creating a linguistic bridge.
Oh, wow. So it was a form of irony.
Exactly. It was highly ironic.
So they were playfully mocking the old world while simultaneously embracing the new one. That makes a lot of sense. But I mean, why did the bee's knees and the cat's pajamas survive a whole century while the clam's garters just faded into complete obscurity?
That really comes down to linguistic natural selection.
Like survival of the fittest, but for words.
Exactly. Slang is this giant social experiment happening in real time, and what survives isn't necessarily what makes the most logical sense. I mean, biologically, bees do not have knees in the traditional sense.
Right. And worms certainly lack ribs.
Right. But language survives based on rhythm and phonetics. It has to feel good to say out loud.
Oh, it has to have that bounce to it.
Yeah, bee's knees has that bouncy internal rhyme, And Cat's Pajamas has this sharp, playful cadence that just rolls off the tongue. They stick in the brain like a catchy pop song.
That makes total sense. The others were probably just clunky.
Right. The others simply didn't pass the evolutionary test of being, fun and effortless to repeat in a loud, crowded room like a speakeasy.
Yeah, that idea of using language to subconsciously process our environment, that actually leads right into something else happening at this time. Because while the youth were making up this ironic animal slang in bars, the scientific community was also using animals to explain the shifting human condition.
Yes, and this was definitely not a joke.
No, not at all. I want to look at the phrase pecking order.
Yeah. The origins of pecking order provide a really stark contrast to the playfulness of, the clam's garters.
Totally. According to the text, pecking order was coined in 1927, and it was in the field of animal behavior studies. Researchers were observing the literal social hierarchy among flocks of chickens.
Right, actual chickens.
Literal chickens.
Yeah.
They documented how higher-ranking birds would rule over the flock by physically pecking the animals below them. They established dominance through this relentless physical oppression.
Which sounds brutal when you really think about it.
It is. And I want you, listening right now, to just think about how we use that term today. Think about your office.
Oh, yeah.
Think about a rigid corporate hierarchy or the politics of, climbing the ladder. We use pecking order to describe who holds the power and who gets pushed down.
We are quite literally comparing our managers, directors, and CEOs to a flock of oppressive poultry.
We really are. But the question is, how does a highly specific, literal scientific observation about chickens just jump out of an academic paper and into the mainstream vocabulary of the 1930s so quickly?
Well, it happened rapidly because society desperately needed a term for what they were experiencing.
What do you mean?
So the late 1920s saw the rise of the massive modern corporation. Before this era, business structures were largely localized, right? And relatively flat.
Like small mom and pop shops.
Exactly. But suddenly you have these giant monolithic companies with layers and layers of middle management. You have typing pools, supervisors, floor managers, and executives.
So people were suddenly just like cogs in a massive machine.
Exactly. The average worker was experiencing an entirely new type of systemic bureaucratic oppression.
Wow.
So when the public caught wind of this scientific term describing a rigid, top-down hierarchy where the guys at the top ruthlessly peck at the folks at the bottom, it resonated perfectly.
It's exactly what they were living through.
Yeah, right. The scientific term so perfectly captured modern human social dynamics that society essentially stole the phrase from the laboratory to describe their own daily misery.
That is fascinating. It highlights how we are constantly hunting for the right vocabulary to shrink a massive, overwhelming world down to a manageable size, which is actually a perfect lens for looking at two other terms that emerged in this exact decade to organize all that chaos.
Because as society scaled up, the old ways of managing human interaction simply broke down. You need new systems to handle new complexities.
Right. And the sources provide two incredible examples of this. First, we have the buddy system, which the text notes was coined in 1920.
Yeah.
And it specifically highlights its initial use for school children, right?
Yeah.
Pairing them up so they were responsible for one another's safety.
A very structured approach.
Yeah. But then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we jump to 1927, where we get the term grease monkey.
Right. Quite a jump.
Yeah. This was a playful, somewhat sarcastic term that emerged in the U.S. to describe mechanics. And I'm really struggling to see the connective tissue here. One is a strict, formalized child safety protocol, and the other is a nickname for blue-collar workers. How do these both reflect the same cultural shift?
Well, they are both psychological responses to the terrifying scale of the 1920s.
Really? How so?
Look at the buddy system. Prior to this era, in smaller agrarian communities, child safety was communal,
Right, the whole village watched the kids.
Exactly. But suddenly you have this explosive urban expansion, schools are massive, the streets are crowded with strangers and speeding vehicles. You can no longer rely on the passive safety of a small town.
Oh, wow. So because the village is gone, you literally have to invent a protocol.
You are forced to institutionalize safety. The buddy system is a society recognizing that the world has become too big and too dangerous to navigate alone.
That is so incredibly sad, but also so logical.
Right. And Grease Monkey comes from that exact same pressure of scale. The 1920s saw Henry Ford's mass production line just completely change the world. Suddenly, millions of loud, heavy, potentially deadly combustion engines are hurtling down the roads.
And to the average person, A car engine must have seemed like, I don't know, terrifying magic.
It was incredibly intimidating technology, so an entirely new profession explodes basically overnight. The auto mechanic.
Right.
These are guys covered in black oil, crawling underneath these massive steel machines, performing tasks the average citizen just doesn't understand.
So it's scary.
Yes. So calling them grease monkeys was a way to demystify the profession. It took this imposing, modern, mechanical world and made it relatable, playful, and most importantly, human.
Oh, I love that. We use humor to defang the things that intimidate us.
Precisely.
But, even with new protocols like the buddy system, and even if you're laughing at the local grease monkey, the sheer speed of this societal change took a massive physical toll on people.
Oh, absolutely.
The rules of daily life were being rewritten overnight. And that disruption brought us what might be my favorite phrase from this entire deep dive: the heebie-jeebies.
It is a brilliantly evocative phrase.
It really is. The source describes the heebie-jeebies as a feeling of unsettled agitation or severe jitters. Now, the origins are completely murky. No one knows the exact etymological root. But we do know that a cartoonist named Billy DeBeck either popularized it or invented it out of thin air in his comic strips in the 1920s.
Which really demonstrates the immense emerging power of mass media at the time. A single syndicated comic strip could invent a word on Sunday, and by Wednesday, the entire country is using it to describe their anxiety.
It's like going viral before the internet.
Exactly.
And they have plenty of anxiety to describe. I mean, I want to ask you listening right now, have you ever gotten the heebie-jeebies before a date?
I think we all have.
Right. Because this is the exact same era that gave us the phrase blind date. Our sources note it was invented in the United States and first recorded in print in 1921. It was this incognito, entirely unvetted means of making a romantic connection.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the invention of the blind date represents a staggering departure from human history.
You think about the generation right before the 1920s. Courtship was highly regulated. If you wanted to date someone in the 1890s or 1900s, you sat in a parlor.
Under very watchful eyes.
Exactly. The parents were in the room, probably reading or sewing, just watching your every move. It was orchestrated and it was safe.
And then suddenly you have a generation with access to automobiles.
Right.
They're leaving the family parlor, getting into a car, and meeting a complete stranger at a speakeasy or a jazz club, entirely unchaperoned.
Which must have been equally exhilarating and completely terrifying, which perfectly explains why they needed the phrase heebie-jeebies. Your body would physically react to breaking thousands of years of social conditioning.
Absolutely.
And this newfound freedom ties into another phrase from 1921, along for the ride. The text notes this originally meant accompanying someone, but it didn't strictly require a literal physical ride in a car.
Right, it became a broader metaphor.
Exactly. It just meant passively going along with whatever scenario was unfolding.
Because the youth of the 1920s were navigating a world without a map, their parents couldn't give them advice on how to handle a blind date because their parents had never been on one.
Right, they had no frame of reference.
None. So a lot of people were simply tagging along for the ride, letting the momentum of this new liberated society just carry them forward into untested waters.
But, I mean, when you have an entire generation suddenly sneaking out on blind dates, getting into cars, and drinking illegal alcohol, it fundamentally changes human psychology.
Oh, for sure.
Because if everyone is doing something they aren't supposed to be doing, it naturally fosters a cultural obsession with secrets. It breeds a society of voyeurs.
The concept of a hidden private life suddenly became a universal experience.
Which brings us to the phrase, fly on the wall. The text dates this back to 1927. It originally describes someone having a surreptitiously unseen view of something salacious, something they desperately wanted to witness but were absolutely not supposed to see. Now, the sources do clarify that the adjective form-like when we describe a documentary film as being fly on the wall, that didn't emerge until the early 1940s.
Right, the cinematic term came later.
Yeah. But the original 1927 coinage was purely about snooping on salacious secrets.
Which makes sense. It is the ultimate fantasy of an era defined by hidden behavior.
Oh, definitely.
Everyone knew their neighbors were breaking the rules, and they wanted to be in the room to watch it happen, completely unnoticed.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Because that voyeurism wasn't just directed at the neighbors next door. It was happening on a mass scale. And it gave birth to modern celebrity culture.
Yes.
The text details the phrase on screen, which showed up in 1929 to describe the events happening in the movies. But what is incredibly telling is that the opposing adjective off-screen didn't appear until 3 full years later, in 1932.
And that 3-year gap is a profound window into the evolution of media consumption.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because in 1929, the public is just mesmerized by the technology itself. The fact that moving pictures exist on screen is enough of a thrill.
It was magic.
Right. But it takes 3 years for society to realize that the glamorous people on the screen actually have secret hidden lives when the cameras stop rolling.
Yeah, the text notes that off-screen evolved specifically to refer to the private lives of the stars.
Right.
The public realized that the polished on-screen narrative was a fiction, and the off-screen reality was where the actual drama lived. They wanted to be a fly on the wall in Hollywood.
And that obsession with uncovering the hidden truth, it ties perfectly into another word from our sources. Whodunit,
Ah, yes.
the intentionally misspelled term for a murder mystery. The text says whodunit was unearthed in records from 1929, but it truly caught fire in 1930 thanks to a book review by the American journalist Donald Forden.
The whodunit was essentially the gamification of this new societal obsession. People were so conditioned to look for hidden motives and secret behaviors in their own lives, that they wanted their entertainment to reflect that exact same puzzle.
And if we want to talk about the ultimate hidden behavior of the 1920s, we absolutely have to look at the phrase under the counter.
Oh, definitely.
Dating back to 1927, the text notes this originally referred specifically to the illicit dealing happening during Prohibition.
Because you couldn't legally buy a bottle of gin out in the open.
Right, so you handed over your money, and the bartender just slipped you a bottle under the counter.
All of these phrases fly on the wall, on screen and off screen, whodunit, under the counter. They all expose the fundamental dichotomy of the 1920s.
The public morality versus the private reality.
Precisely. You had the beautiful, curated on-screen life that was presented to the world, and then you had the messy, illicit, under-the-counter or off-screen reality where people were actually drinking, going on blind dates, and breaking all the rules. Society became deeply obsessed with pulling back the curtain. Whether they were reading a whodunit novel to solve a fictional crime or wishing they could be a fly on the wall in a crowded speakeasy, the entire culture was driven by a desperate desire to uncover the truth beneath the polished surface of modern life.
It is genuinely staggering to think about how much human history, anxiety, and rebellion is packed into these tiny, seemingly insignificant phrases we throw around every single day.
It really is.
So what does this all mean? Well, it means that you, listening to this deep dive right now, are basically a walking, talking museum.
I love that framing.
Thanks. But seriously, the next time you get the heebie-jeebies before a big meeting, or you complain about the pecking order at your office, or you joke about just tagging along for the ride, you are acting as a linguistic time capsule.
Yeah.
You are keeping the anxieties and the triumphs of the jazz age alive with literally every sentence you speak.
Which is incredible. And this raises an important question, or rather, it reinforces a core truth that we always come back to when we examine our sources. Knowledge is most valuable when it is truly understood.
Oh, absolutely.
We use language so casually, treating it like a disposable tool. But our everyday vocabulary is filled with these hidden histories. When you understand the origin of grease monkey or the profound shift represented by a blind date, you aren't just memorizing trivia.
Right. It's bigger than that.
You are directly connecting with the lived experiences of people who stood exactly where you are, staring down a rapidly changing world a whole 100 years ago.
It really makes you pause and rethink every text message you type out.
Okay.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on everything we just discussed.
Okay.
If the bizarre, spontaneous slang of the 1920s, words cobbled together from cartoonists, animal behaviorists, and rebellious teenagers, survived a whole century because they so perfectly captured the cultural shifts of their era. What bizarre modern slang from our current decade will people unknowingly be using 100 years from now to describe their everyday lives?
That is a wild thought.
Right. What will the people of the year 2120 be saying that they inherited from us without even realizing it? Something to think about the next time you hear a teenager invent a new catchphrase. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.